Now, I would like to welcome Professor Bradley Corbett to deliver his keynote speech. He is a Canadian educator who is currently working in Southeast Asia. He holds the position of Director of International Programs for the Vietschool Pandora school systems in Vietnam. During the past 6 years, he has worked in Thailand and Vietnam as an academic educational consultant for programs and in the application of learning technologies at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. Dr. Corbett worked for the Government of Canada as a research analyst and as a faculty member at the Ivy School of Business. He has extensive experience in studying educational trends in education through analysis of data such as the Program for International Student Assessment and other large data sets relating to students' educational outcomes.
Hello and welcome to the ICTEMR Second International Conference on Technology, Innovation, Education, and Multidisciplinary Skills in the 21st Century Research. My name is Dr. Bradley Corbett and I'd like to welcome you to the conference this year. Today I'd like to set the stage by talking about the devastating impact of COVID-19, 2021, 22, and who knows how much longer on education. The conference is looking at innovative educational technologies, and so this presentation will talk about set the stage for the environment that we're working in, which has presented challenges but also opportunities for us to learn how to innovate and to do things in a different way. UNESCO predicted that 1.5 billion students have been impacted by school closures and disruptions in 2020. More than 100 million children will fall below the minimum reading proficiency levels. And the impacts are severe and significant, but some of the most important ones include interrupted learnings, gaps in childcare, rises in dropout rates, increased exposure to violence and exploitation, and social isolation. So you can see that the impact of COVID-19 has been significant and very devastating to the global economy and the people who live here. The first thing I'd like to talk about today is the student outcomes and how they have been impacted. School outcomes and school performance in particular have been experiencing mixed results. You know, some of the studies indicate some students can do better in some areas, while other studies indicate students do much worse in other areas. So we can see in regards to student performance that we have a lot of room for innovation because there are a lot of problems that we have that need to be resolved. For example, I run a small English center in Hanoi, and we had been training our students to use a learning management system prior to the COVID shutdowns. And just as the students were learning this technology, we noticed when the closures happened that half of the students were able to adapt. We had trained them to use the learning technologies, including video conferencing, and they could study online through our learning management system. Well, the other half of the students struggled and they were not able to continue their studies. So in Hanoi, some of the parents decided to send their children out of the city to the countryside where the grandparents live and aunts and uncles. And so those students that were displaced and moved outside of the city were finding it difficult to continue through the online studies. So we see that even among students there were mixed results, and even within the individual students, some students performed better and were able to improve their learning in some aspects, while other aspects suffered. Secondly, we need to consider the case of older versus younger students. So the older students that I teach were actually quite adaptive, and in fact, they preferred to study online. Many of them, when given the opportunity to come back to class, decided that they would prefer to continue their studies online. Well, younger students, they don't do so well when they're studying online. So when this younger students are studying online, they're not as familiar with the technology. Maybe they don't have the parental support that's necessary for a young child to focus online. Actually, they're pretty good with the use of the technology. They can turn the microphone and camera on and off, and they can interact with the teacher quite well. But you know, the students are still, that were young, they still struggled when we tried to teach the same amount of time in class. Second thing that we need to consider is the health status of the students. So there are very significant mental health issues that the students faced when they were staying home during the lockdowns. The students suffered very significant mental health issues because they were not allowed to go outside. They were not allowed to socialize with their friends. There was a significant amount of depression and sadness and you know, general displeasure among the students. I think the students in Vietnam really did great during the first series of lockdowns, probably better than students in North America from what I'm reading. The students in North America seem to experience a lot of separation anxiety and a lot of problems related to not being able to connect with their friends. During the first lockdown for about 3 or 4 months, the students that I had were still in pretty good spirits. I attribute that to the fact that the Vietnamese families are very close, and I think the closeness of the family helped the students to get through that. In the later lockdown periods, I'm not sure that they were as resilient. The sheer amount of time that the students were experiencing lockdowns and being separated from their friends was becoming quite devastating in recent times. So, you know, definitely the mental health of the students and not being able to go outside, not being able to exercise and play in the same ways that they had done before, certainly had some implications with their performance and definitely with their behavior. Some students, especially the more intelligent ones, were acting out a bit as they experienced extended lockdowns. Another aspect is the physical. As I mentioned before, the students were not free to go outside and exercise and play and do the physical things. So they became less physically fit. And as well, that plays into the mental aspect because they were a bit depressed or unhappy because they couldn't do things like play basketball. And finally, the social health of the students really suffered. As I said, they the students did okay in Vietnam, pretty well for the first part of the pandemic, but the second and third lockdowns really showed social stress and social strain. Recently, I talked to a young girl whose family is doing well, and she lives in an apartment complex, but she's just very discouraged that she's still not able to play and socialize with her friends, and she really misses that aspect of the educational experience. Finally, with regard to student outcomes, student time management seems to be a huge issue related to the use of technology. Some students are able to manage their time and to be able to focus on their work, but other students find it very challenging to study when they're working from home. There's a lot of distractions and a lot of things that create problems for the students as they're studying, as well as there may not be somebody there to monitor them or to make sure they're behaving properly. The second thing I'd like to talk about today is institutional challenges. So from the perspective of the schools and the educational institutions, a lot of challenges occurred due to the lockdowns and the government's decision not to allow students to come to school during the COVID time. The first issue I'd like to raise is that of principal leadership. So basically there was a complete disruption of the way that schools and teachers operate. Obviously the students were not allowed to come to school. In the earlier shutdowns, even the teachers didn't come to school. There was some very tight regulations in terms of people's movements and freedoms. So principals had the challenge of trying to manage their staff and trying to manage the students and the school in an environment where they had never experienced before. So imagine trying to deal with your staff from a distance, and not only that, but you're dealing with teachers who are also managing large class sizes, and the teachers are also finding challenges at various levels. That leads to our second point, the teacher readiness and skill. So obviously many teachers have some background in technology, but a significant amount of teachers were not comfortable with using technology, especially new teaching technology and video conferencing. So the teacher readiness was definitely lacking. A lot of teachers, especially the older teachers or those that were not interested in technology prior to, had significant challenges trying to set up and use technology from their home during the COVID era. So the teachers had to manage that as well. They were expected to manage, have the skill and experience of teaching online. So teaching, some aspects are the same, but teaching online has some very different aspects, and if teachers haven't had that experience, then they really struggled with the ability to control the classroom, to convey the message and the lesson to their students, I remember some students complaining to me about one teacher who was a physics teacher and writing the formulas on a piece of paper and holding his phone above the piece of paper, and the students couldn't make out what the formulas were, what the reading was. So this was an example of how some teachers simply weren't ready for teaching online. A third thing that we can talk about is the quality and the impact of teachers. So when I was working in Thailand with some of the provincial schools, we were trying to implement a learning management system. And some of the teachers were able to adapt it. They were very excited about it. And, you know, they were very instrumental in helping us get their school off the ground. Other teachers had significant difficulty with even the simplest things like logging into the learning management system. So those teachers required some help. They were actually quite good at, once we showed them how to log in, once we got their passwords sorted out, and once they got on, then they did pretty good. But even the process of logging on was quite difficult for some teachers. Another aspect is the teacher quality, but the teachers have to rely on the parents much more in an online study system. The teachers don't have the students in the classroom to control. And as I mentioned before with the younger students, sometimes teachers were just teaching young kids online with no parental control. So you can imagine what it would be like to have 15 or 20 6-year-olds online and trying to manage them and tell them to turn their microphone off, turn the camera on, and trying to keep their attention through online teaching. So parental involvement is very challenging. It's very important to have parental involvement, especially in the early days until the students settle down into their routines. And some parents simply didn't have the skills or time to be able to manage their students as they were studying at home. The second thing that parents and teachers had to do was communicate. So we had to learn how to communicate more through online SMS services and different emails and so forth. So you can imagine the challenge that teachers have when they have homework assignments for the students and they want the students to do certain things to prepare for the next class. Well, all of that information has to be conveyed to the student, but also to the parent, because the students often, especially in the early days, use that as an excuse not to do the work. So if some students wanted to get out of doing their studies or doing their work, they simply didn't pass the message along to the parents, and then the teachers would inform the parents later that there's a problem. Luckily in Vietnam here, the people use SMS systems frequently. So the teachers were quite innovative and able to adapt to the communications, creating groups for the parents and sending messages. So it only took a few times of the students using the excuse of not being able to know what they had to do before the teachers innovated and started sending out SMS messages. So because people use it so frequently here, most parents were able to adapt in that way. Finally, we have the issue of teacher supports. So we know that the amount of supports that teachers have, especially around technology and innovative solutions, can determine their success during these times. So we see that personal learning supports, for example, the number of people that they have around them that can help them if they encounter a problem. So imagine if you were new to technology, you had to log on. If you have a young child or grandchild around that can help you log on and understand that process, then those people could do the processes much easier than someone who didn't really have a community of people to help them with their learning. So how to use the technology, how to teach, understanding how to teach online, and what kind of supports were necessary. So my business partner and fellow teacher at the English Center had never taught online, but because I was from a Western country and I had a lot of experience in this area, I was able to help her learn quickly, and within just a few days she was up and running. And after the 3 to 4 month shutdown, she actually preferred to study online by the time the lockdown had finished. So it was really quite interesting that she was able to adapt so quickly, and that she actually liked teaching online better than she did in the classroom in some respects. Also, we have the issue of self-directed learning. So working online requires the teachers to learn themselves. As anybody that's used technology knows, all of the answers are on Google. So we were able to check that out and find the answer to this and the solution. Unfortunately, people that don't have those self-directed learning abilities, they struggled a lot more than the others. And finally, we have the issue of personal and family demands. There are a lot of those people who have a lot of challenges during the COVID era, and because they had those challenges, they experienced a lot of difficulty to try to maintain the same level of professionalism in their job. They had a lot of personal and family demands, and adding on top of that all of the learning they would have to do for teaching in the environment, etc., was very challenging for teachers. Okay, so let's move on to the next issue, which is equity and equality issues. So the difference between equity and equality is that equity is lifting up the people who have more challenges, so that they have an equal standing with others. Equality is equally separating the resources between people. So dividing it by the number of the availability divided by the demand. So we can see that throughout the world there's a lot of equity and equality issues around access to technology. Even with the vaccinations, we had this issue of the challenges between where to distribute and who should get the vaccinations first as they're being manufactured. So the same goes with technology. Some places have a lot more capacity and better technology access nationwide, while other places they suffer. Another issue to consider is students with disabilities. Many students don't have the capacity to learn on their own. They have some sort of disability or difficulty that creates additional challenges for them. So in the era of COVID and studying at home, who's going to help those children? Obviously, parents can do what they can, but often they're not professional enough to understand these issues. And finally, we have the issue of the level of parental involvement. We know in things like reading, for example, a child's literacy is increased as the parent spends more and more time working with the children. The same will go in this circumstance. When children are learning online, they require a certain amount of support. Not all of the children need support, but many children do. And if the parents don't have the ability to be involved and to help the students with their online learning, then those students will experience a disadvantage in their life. Okay, so basically I've outlined a few of the major challenges that educators have faced during the COVID era. We talked about the challenges to student outcomes, student performance, health, and student management. We also talked about institutional challenges that leaders and teachers experienced. We talked about equity and equality issues and trying to figure out who gets the most help and who should get access to limited resources, and the problems that we experience based on things like disabilities and parental level involvement. So to conclude, I would like to just highlight these points, and we need to understand that this talk is setting the stage for the discussion of innovation and technology that has been used to address the COVID crisis that we've all been facing over the past several years. So I'm looking forward to all of the excellent presentations that will be made by the participants in the conference. I am sad that we can't meet in person, but I'm glad that we have technology and the ability to study. And I really wish you a very fruitful and beneficial time learning about all of the great innovations in education using technology during these challenging times. Thank you very much.